Hello everyone and welcome back to another video, and today I will be reviewing Logan. I'm going to say right off the bat that this is the best X-Men movie that there is out there right now. There are so many great qualities about this movie. The fact that it's rated R, and the fact that it has an amazing story, and has a perfect ending to Wolverine as a character. For anyone wondering, this is still part of the main X-Men timeline that we have seen from the past X-Men movies. The X-Men were only really talked about once, and that was a one-liner basically from the radio that they were listening to. Before I tell you what happened to the X-Men, I should tell you about the fact that Professor X is in this movie, but he's very old and fragile. Both Logan and Professor X are very old now. And with Professor X, he has Alzheimer's, ALS, and he has constant seizures that need to be medicated. When Professor X has his seizures, it affects everyone in the vicinity. The best way I can describe it is that Professor X can paralyze everyone in the vicinity, and with his seizures, when this happens, he can't control it. What makes this worse is the fact that he can actually kill people by doing this, and that brings us back to what happened to the X-Men. From what I recall, there was a radio broadcast happening, and it mentioned that there was an incident a year before the events of this movie, saying that there was an event exactly like what happened at the hotel they were at, but the X-Men were involved and they were killed. It's actually quite depressing when you think about it, because Professor X didn't do it on purpose, and he was fully aware of what was happening. That's one of the reasons why I like the fact that this movie is rated R, because they can go into mature subjects, like for instance ending one's life and dealing with the fact that you are getting older. Speaking of rated R, I really like the violence in this movie. This movie has the violence that I've always wanted from a Wolverine movie. I always found it funny in the older X-Men movies that Wolverine would stab somebody and there would be absolutely no blood or gore. Having this movie rated R makes it a lot more realistic, so we can see more brutality from Wolverine, and we can actually see him stabbing people and cutting their limbs off. I feel like having the blood and gore adds more of an impact to the fight scenes, especially in the fight scene at the very end. We also learned that mutants haven't been born in about 25 years. This is a very interesting premise, because it brings up the question of why there haven't been more mutants lately, and how many mutants are still out there. All the other mutants that we see in this movie are either very old, or they are little children born from test tubes. Let's talk about one of the main characters of the movie, and that is Laura. I really like her character. I also really like the fact that she's Wolverine's daughter. The one thing that I found pretty cool was the fact that she has claws coming out of her feet. In the first real fight scene of this movie, we see Laura fight all of the enemy soldiers, and she's doing a great job at it. At the end of the fight, we see Laura being taken away, but before she's taken away, the claws in her feet come out, and she starts stabbing them with the claws. I really like it as well because she's smaller, so it's harder for them to shoot at her, and she can get to lower places, as well as being more agile, which makes it even easier for her to take them out. I mentioned in my review for the Wolverine that the stakes were higher because his healing abilities were not present. It's kind of the same thing for this movie, but a little bit different, and I'll explain why. As I mentioned before, Wolverine is older, and this means that his healing abilities are not as high as they should be. What I mean by this is that, let's say if he is shot in the chest, it would take an hour for that wound to heal, instead of a couple of seconds. What this means is that it's a lot easier for him to get killed or beaten to a pulp. This adds more tension to the movie, because you know he's weaker, and this means that he could die at any time in any fight. I just like the fact that in all the Wolverine movies, they seem to find something to make the stakes higher, even though Wolverine is indestructible. I also like the premise in this movie that the adamantium is poisoning Wolverine. In all honesty, it's something you would never think about, but when it's mentioned, it does make a lot of sense. I think it's a lot like mercury poisoning, where after a certain amount of time, it starts to get into your bloodstream and it degrades your organs, and it's just something you wouldn't think would happen to Wolverine, but it does. I'm not sure if this was ever introduced in the comics, but it's still a very smart way of explaining why his abilities are not up to par. Although this is a very smart way of explaining why Wolverine is dying, I really wish that they had mentioned that in early movies, because then it would have sparked something in our minds to think of how that could play into future storylines. But that's not even a complaint, it's just a wish. I found it pretty depressing that Wolverine was killed in this movie. Admittedly, it was a very good ending for his character, because in a way, it's kind of wholesome how he died. I don't know if that's the right way of saying it, but that's what I feel. When we are first introduced to Wolverine in the first X-Men movie, he's very selfish, and it's all about him, and he doesn't really care about anybody else. Same thing for the beginning of this movie. He really didn't care about anybody else, and he just wanted to make money so he and Professor X could move somewhere where they are safe. As the movie goes on, Wolverine starts to connect the dots about certain things, and that makes him care more about other characters. Towards the end of the movie, we start to see more emotion out of Wolverine. Emotion that we really haven't seen from him. Usually when he shows his emotion, it's anger and nothing else. But in this movie, we see more sadness out of him than anything else. He still gets very angry in this movie. It's just that we see more sadness out of him. For instance, when Professor X died, he was actually tearing up. Which, I know in X-Men 3 that he did feel sad for Professor X. But in this movie, it just felt different. The other example is at the end of the movie when he saved all those children. He could have just let them go and just drive back to wherever he came from. But no, he decided to save the kids and risk his own life for them. This is why I think it's full circle for Wolverine. He started out as a very angry, miserable person, and in his final moments, he was the one to save others and not be selfish. This movie was written really well, and by my few examples, this just proves that the script is very solid and the story is hard to beat, especially with superhero movies. Another thing I wanted to talk about in this review isn't exactly about the movie, but it is at the same time. Ever since this movie came out, people have obviously been saddened by Wolverine's death, and I am one of those who were saddened. What I am saying is that a lot of people want Wolverine to come back in some form when the X-Men are finally introduced to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In all honesty, I feel like they should not bring him back. I know that's going to be a controversial statement, but let me explain why. So I mentioned a lot that Wolverine started out as a miserable man and he had no sympathy for others. And then towards the end of his life he had sympathy for others and literally had himself killed to save other people. Having Wolverine return, especially if it's Hugh Jackman, is a bad idea. I'd say it's a bad idea because it would throw that entire movie out the window. Because the whole meaning of this movie was for him to finally have peace. And he went out in such a way that you just can't undo something like that. I have the utmost trust in the fact that Marvel will not resurrect Wolverine. I understand that Wolverine is such an influential character, but the thing is that we can't have them alive forever. Every story has to end. I like stories to end before they get bad. And with Wolverine, that's what happened. It ended perfectly, and if he was resurrected, what else could they possibly do with the character? I have the same opinion about Iron Man as well, but that's not what this review is for. I know this review wasn't as long as my other reviews, and especially for such a long movie, you would think that my review would be longer. But I've said a lot about this movie, I feel like. So what would I rate this movie? For a Marvel movie, I rate this a 10 out of 10 because it's honestly one of the best movies I've ever seen. The story is so well written, and the characters get their proper send-offs. I like the fact that the movie is rated R, so that means they can go into more mature themes, and the violence and the gore were amazing, and I feel like it provided the creators of this movie more freedom with the character. I also really like the fact that we are introduced to Laura, who just happens to be Wolverine's daughter. I feel like we should see those children mutants again in future projects, especially Wolverine's daughter. This would be a perfect segue into the MCU. Honestly, can't find any issue with this movie, and it's perfect all around. So, that's the end of the Wolverine saga. Now, I will review the last few X-Men movies. Thank you all so much for watching this review, and see you in the next video.